Welcome back, travellers of time. Tonight our journey carries us further into the past than we have ever gone. Back beyond the cities, beyond the kings, beyond writing itself, to a hill on a quiet plain where the first temple in the world still waits in the dark. So settle in. There is no hurry here. Let the quiet gather and let the story carry you back. On a low, rounded hill in the south of what is now Turkey, there stands a ring of great carved stones that should not exist. They should not exist because of when they were made. Not a few centuries before the famous monuments of the ancient world, but thousands of years before the first city, before the first written word, before the first wheel turned, or the first metal was smelted, or the first pot was fired. These stones were raised around 11,500 years ago, which means they are older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years and older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt by 7,000. When the pharaohs looked upon the pyramids as ancient wonders, these stones had already been standing and then sleeping under the earth for longer than all of recorded history laid end to end. They are, as far as we know, the oldest monumental structures ever built by human hands anywhere on the planet. And they should not exist because of who made them. Not a great kingdom with armies of labourers and a god-king to command them. Not a settled civilization with farms and granaries and cities. They were carved and raised by hunter-gatherers, by people we long dismissed as simple, primitive, scattered bands of wanderers who followed the herds and gathered wild plants and could barely, we assumed, organise anything more complex than a hunt. People with no agriculture, no writing, no metal tools, no wheel, no draft animals, no cities, no kings. And somehow these supposedly primitive nomads quarried limestone pillars weighing as much as 10 or 15 tons, carved them with astonishing skill into strange, watchful, human-shaped beings, decorated them with a menagerie of wild and dangerous animals, hauled them across the land and raised them into vast rings on a hilltop, again and again, for centuries. It is one of the greatest puzzles in the whole story of humanity, and it forces a single staggering question upon us. If everything we thought we knew about the birth of civilization was right, then this place cannot be here. And yet here it is. Before we climb that hill together, and the climb will take us back to the very edge of the human story, to the moment before farming and cities and everything we call the modern world, and to a mystery about who we are that no one has fully solved. Let me ask one small thing of you. If these quiet journeys into the deep past are the kind of thing you look forward to, the ones you save for the end of the day, leave a gentle like before you settle in. It helps this story find others more than you would think. Follow along with the channel so the next lost world finds its way to you when it rises out of the dark. And if you have a moment, leave a single word below and tell us where in the world you're listening from tonight, the name of your city and the hour showing on your clock as you read this. There is something quietly moving on nights like these in seeing how far apart we all are, scattered across the turning earth, and how a ring of stones carved by nameless hands 11,000 years ago still gathers us together in the dark. Now, let us go back, past the cities, past the empires, past writing itself, all the way to the hill on the plain and the people who built the first temple in the world. To feel the full weight of this mystery, you have to first unlearn a story so neat and so often repeated that most of us absorbed it without ever questioning it. It is the story of how civilization began. The story goes like this. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings lived as hunter-gatherers, wandering in small bands, following the animals and the seasons, never staying anywhere for long. They were clever and capable in their way, but they lived hand to mouth, always moving, and so they could never build anything permanent, never gather in large numbers, never create the surplus of food and time that great works require. Then, around 10 or 12,000 years ago, something changed. Somewhere in the Near East, people learned to farm, to plant seeds, to harvest grain, to tame animals. And farming changed everything. It tied people to the land, so they settled into villages. It produced surplus food, so populations grew and some people were freed from the endless search for food to become craftsmen and priests and rulers. Out of the settled village grew the town, and out of the town the city, and out of the city everything else. Kings, temples, writing, law, and at last the great monuments that only an organised, wealthy, settled society could afford to build. First came the farm, then the village, then the city. And only then, at the top of that long ladder, once people had food and leisure and organisation to spare, could they finally raise temples to their gods. It is a beautiful, logical story. Agriculture first, then everything else. Bread before belief. The full belly before the raised stone. For a long time it was simply accepted as the way things must have happened, because it made such obvious sense. You cannot build a temple until you have a surplus to feed the builders. You cannot organise hundreds of workers until you have a settled society to organise them. The monument sits at the end of the road, the crowning achievement of a civilization that has already arrived. Everyone knew this. It was in every textbook. It was the foundation of how we understood our own deep past. And then a low hill in southeastern Turkey quietly demolished it. Because at Göbekli Tepe, the order is wrong, impossibly, maddeningly wrong. Here is a monument, a genuinely monumental one, requiring enormous labour, skill, planning, and the coordinated effort of many people over long periods. And it comes not at the end of the story, but at the very beginning. It was built before the farms, before the villages that farming was supposed to create, before the surplus, before the cities, before the kings and the priests and all the machinery that was supposed to be necessary before anyone could raise such a thing. The people who built it were still hunting wild gazelle and gathering wild grain. They had not yet, when they began, domesticated a single plant or animal. By the old story, they should have been utterly incapable of this. And yet they did it, and they did it thousands of years before the story says it should have been possible. Sit with what that means, because it is genuinely disorienting. It means the ladder was upside down. It means the monument did not come at the end of the climb towards civilization. It may have come at the very start, and it may even have been one of the things that caused the climb. It means that the deepest assumption we held about ourselves, that we build great things only after we have secured our survival, that belief is a luxury that comes after bread, might be exactly backwards. At Göbekli Tepe, it looks as though the temple came first and everything else followed, as though the human need to gather, to worship, to build something greater and more lasting than a single life was not a late flower of civilization, but one of its deepest roots, perhaps the root from which the rest grew. The man who excavated the site, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, put it in a single sentence that has echoed through archaeology ever since. First came the temple, he said, and then the city, not the other way around. And if he was right, if the drive to build sacred monuments came before and helped bring about the settled farming life we thought had to come first, then Göbekli Tepe is not just an old ruin. It is a window into the moment our species changed, a clue to why we stopped wandering and started building, and a mirror held up to something essential and mysterious about what human beings are. We are, it seems to whisper, the creatures who build temples. We were doing it before we did almost anything else. But a whisper is not an answer, and Göbekli Tepe raises far more questions than it settles. Who exactly were these people? How did nomads with stone tools quarry and move and raise 10-ton pillars? What did the strange carved beings on those pillars mean to them? Gods, ancestors, the honoured dead? Why did they cover the pillars in images of snakes and scorpions and vultures and other creatures of danger and death? What drew them, again and again over the centuries, to this one hill? And strangest of all, why, after all that labour, did they eventually take the whole thing and deliberately bury it, filling their own temple with rubble and turning it back into a nameless hill, where it would sleep, forgotten, for 8,000 years, until a curious archaeologist looked again at what everyone else had walked past? To answer those questions, as far as they can be answered at all, we have to go back to the world these people lived in. Not the world of cities and kings, which did not yet exist, but the wild, cold, beautiful world at the end of the last great ice age, on the day before everything changed. We have to stand on the plain beneath the hill before a single stone was raised, and see the land as they saw it. Because the story of Göbekli Tepe does not begin with the stones. It begins, as this channel's stories so often do, with the land itself, and with a people we spent a very long time underestimating. Begin with the land, because the land came first, and the land shaped everything. Picture the south of what we now call Turkey, in the region where the great highlands of Anatolia begin to descend toward the plains of Mesopotamia. This is the northern edge of a broad arc of unusually fertile country that curves through the Near East, the belt of good land that scholars named the Fertile Crescent, the cradle in which so much of the human future would be planted. But we are visiting it long before any of that future had arrived. We're visiting it around 12,000 years ago, at the tail end of the last ice age, when the great cold that had gripped the world for tens of thousands of years was finally loosening its hold. It was a landscape of rolling limestone hills and wide plains, cut by rivers running down from the mountains toward the distant Mesopotamian lowlands. The two great rivers that would one day water the first cities, the ones the Greeks would call the Tigris and the Euphrates, had their beginnings in these highlands, born of mountain, snow and rain. And as the Ice Age released its grip and the world warmed, this land became something close to a paradise for the people who lived in it. Where the ice had retreated, forests of oak and pistachio and almond spread across the hills. Wild grasses grew thick on the plains, and among them, growing wild in dense natural stands, were the ancestors of the grains that would one day feed civilization. Wild einkorn wheat, wild barley, wild rye, ripening across whole hillsides thick enough to harvest by the armful. The rivers and marshes teemed with fish and waterfowl, and across the plains moved great herds of animals, gazelle in their thousands, wild sheep and goats, wild cattle, wild boar, red deer, all of it a moving feast for anyone with the skill to hunt. This is the crucial thing to understand, and it overturns the second half of the old story just as surely as Göbekli Tepe overturns the first. We tend to imagine hunter-gatherers as living always on the edge of starvation, scraping by, too consumed with mere survival to build or think or dream. But the people of this land, at this moment in history, were not starving. They were living in one of the most naturally abundant environments the world had ever offered to human beings. The wild grain alone, in a good season, could be harvested in such quantities that a family might gather enough in a few weeks to last much of the year. The herds were vast. The rivers were full. For a people who knew this land intimately, and they knew it far better than we can imagine, it offered a richness that made permanent hunger a distant thing. They didn't need farms to be well fed. The wild world here was generous enough on its own, and that abundance had a profound consequence, one that begins to unlock the mystery of the hill. Because when the food does not run out, when the same slopes give grain year after year, when the herds return with the seasons, when the rivers are always full, the ancient logic that kept people constantly on the move begins to loosen. A band that must chase scattered food across a wide territory cannot gather in large numbers or stay long in one place. But a people surrounded by reliable, gatherable abundance can afford to linger. They can afford to come together in larger groups, at least for parts of the year. They can afford to spend time and energy on things other than the immediate search for the next meal. The wealth of this land, strange as it sounds, gave its hunter-gatherers something that hunter-gatherers were not supposed to have: a measure of surplus, of security, of free time and gathered numbers, the very things the old story insisted only farming could provide. The land gave it to them for free. So we must correct our picture of these people before we go any further, because almost everything we instinctively assume about them is wrong. They were not primitive. They were not simple. They were not stupid brutes barely clinging to life. They were the accumulated inheritors of tens of thousands of years of human knowledge and skill, anatomically identical to us, with brains exactly as capable as ours, carrying a vast unwritten library of understanding about their world. They knew, with a precision no modern person could match, every plant on those hills, which could be eaten, which could heal, which could kill, when each ripened and where each grew. They knew every animal, its habits, its tracks, its seasons, its mind. They could read the weather in the sky and the game in the dust. They were master toolmakers, knapping flint into blades of astonishing sharpness and delicacy. They had language, and almost certainly rich traditions of story and song and belief that have left no trace because they were never written down. They were, in every way that matters, fully and completely human, as intelligent, as capable of wonder and planning and art as anyone alive today. The only things they lacked were the particular inventions that had not yet been made, and they were about to make one of the most astonishing of all. For somewhere in the minds of these well-fed, skilled, gathered people, at the end of the Ice Age, on the abundant hills of this land, an idea took hold that had never taken hold before. Not the idea of a better tool, or a better hunt, or a better shelter. Something far stranger, and far more consequential. The idea of building something enormous and permanent and sacred, a place set apart from the ordinary world, a place to gather and to hold ceremonies and to face together whatever it was they believed lay behind the visible world. They looked at a particular hill rising above the plain, and they decided to make it holy. And in deciding that, without knowing it, they took the first step on the road that would lead thousands of years later to every city and cathedral and civilization that has ever existed. The land had made them rich enough to dream. Now they were going to build the dream in stone. Before we can understand what the builders did, we have to understand how, 11,000 years later, we very nearly failed to notice it at all. Because the story of Göbekli Tepe's rediscovery is a lesson in how the greatest truths can lie in plain sight, unseen, simply because no one is expecting them. The hill had a name long before any archaeologist came. The local people called it Göbekli Tepe, which means roughly Potbelly Hill, a plain, affectionate name for a rounded, swelling mound rising above the surrounding plain near the old city of Şanlıurfa in the far southeast of Turkey. It was just a hill. Farmers worked the land around it and on it. A lone mulberry tree grew at its summit, considered sacred by the local people, a place where wishes were tied to the branches. Scattered across the slopes were pieces of broken limestone, some of them clearly worked by human hands, and now and then a plough would turn one up. But no one thought much of it. It was an old place, obviously, with old stones in it. The land was full of old places. In the 1960s, a team of researchers surveying the region for ancient sites did visit the hill. They noted the broken limestone slabs on the surface. They saw the worked stone, and they came to a reasonable, sensible, and completely wrong conclusion. The broken slabs, they decided, were probably gravestones. The hill was most likely an abandoned medieval cemetery, or perhaps a Byzantine-era outpost. Interesting, perhaps, but not remarkable, not ancient in any world-changing way. There were countless such sites across the region. They recorded it, and they moved on. And so the oldest temple in the world sat, correctly identified as containing worked stone, and yet catastrophically misunderstood for another 30 years, passed over, filed away, dismissed. The tools of the survey were not wrong. The eyes were not wrong. What was wrong was the expectation. No one was looking for something 11,000 years old, because the story said nothing. 11,000 years old could possibly be here, and so the truth lay waiting, a few feet under the soil, for someone who was willing to be surprised. That someone was Klaus Schmidt. A German archaeologist working in the region in the 1990s, Schmidt had spent years studying the Neolithic sites of the Near East, and he had trained himself in exactly the thing the earlier surveyors lacked: a willingness to question the expected. In 1994, reading through the old survey records and looking for a new site to excavate, he came across the brief, dismissive notes about the hill called Göbekli Tepe. Most people would have skipped past it. A medieval cemetery held little interest. But something in the description snagged Schmidt's attention. The quantity of worked flint, the scale of the broken limestone. He decided to go and see for himself. And when he walked up the slope of that unremarkable hill and looked at the ground with an eye trained to see the deep past, he understood almost at once that everyone before him had made a colossal mistake. The stones were not medieval gravestones. The flint scattered everywhere was not medieval at all. It was Stone Age, and it lay across the surface in staggering quantities, the debris of enormous prehistoric activity. The broken limestone pieces poking from the soil were not headstones but the tops of something far larger buried beneath. Schmidt later described the moment of recognition in words that have become famous among archaeologists. He knew, he said, that he had only two choices: to walk away and say nothing, or to spend the rest of his life digging here. He chose to stay, and the excavations he began in 1995 would consume the rest of his life and overturn the story of human civilization. Because what Schmidt and his team began to uncover as they dug into that hill was beyond anything anyone had imagined. Just below the surface they found the tops of great T-shaped pillars of limestone. As they dug further, the pillars rose 2 meters, 3, 4, 5.5 meters tall, some weighing 10 tons or more. They found them arranged in circles. They found them carved with animals in relief: foxes, snakes, boars, birds, scorpions. And when they sent samples away to be dated using the material buried around and against the pillars, the results came back with numbers that seemed, at first, like errors. The pillars were not thousands of years old. They were 11,500 years old. They had been raised in the 10th millennium before the Common Era, in the age of the hunter-gatherers, before farming, before pottery, before writing. The oldest monumental architecture ever found anywhere on Earth, by a margin of many thousands of years. Schmidt understood immediately that this changed everything, and he spent the rest of his career carefully, patiently, brilliantly working out what it meant. He recognized that these were not the ruins of a village. There were no houses, no ordinary domestic remains, no signs of daily living. This was something else. This was a place people came to, gathered at, built and rebuilt over centuries, for reasons that were not practical but sacred. It was, he became convinced, a sanctuary, a temple, the oldest in the world. And its existence thousands of years before the settled farming society that was supposed to be a prerequisite for such a thing led him to his revolutionary conclusion that the old story was backwards, that the temple had come before the town, and that the human impulse to build the sacred might have been one of the very forces that gave birth to civilization itself. Klaus Schmidt worked at Göbekli Tepe for nearly 20 years, until his sudden death in 2014, and he did not live to see even half of the site uncovered. But he had done the essential thing. He had looked again at what everyone else had dismissed, and in doing so he had given the human race back the memory of its first great work. Now we must look at that work itself, at the stones he found, and the strange watchful beings carved upon them. Stand now inside one of the great circles as it was first uncovered, and look closely at what stands there, because at first glance the pillars seem simple, and it takes a moment to realize that they are staring back at you. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, at least the oldest and grandest of them, follow a consistent and deliberate plan. Each is a great ring, roughly circular or oval, 10 to 20 meters across, its perimeter formed by a series of the T-shaped limestone pillars set into a low stone wall with a bench running around the inside. And at the very centre of each ring stand two more pillars, the largest of all, taller than the rest, rising 5 meters or more, set facing each other a few paces apart, dominating the whole enclosure. The smaller pillars of the ring seem to face inward, toward these two great central figures, as though gathered around them. The effect, even in ruins, is powerful. A circle of tall standing stones, focused inward upon a central pair, like a congregation turned toward an altar, or a council gathered around its chiefs. Now look closer at the shape of the pillars themselves, because it holds the first great revelation. They are not simple slabs. They are T-shaped, a tall vertical shaft topped by a wide horizontal block like the letter T. For a long time you might look at that shape and see only an abstract form, but then you notice the carvings, and everything shifts. On many of the pillars running down the front of the vertical shaft there are arms, carved in low relief, a pair of arms, the elbows bending, the forearms coming around to the front, and at the bottom, meeting near where a belt sits, a pair of human hands with long, carefully carved fingers. And once you have seen the arms and the hands, you cannot unsee what the pillar is. The wide horizontal top is a head. The tall shaft is a body. The T-shape is a human figure, vastly stylized, faceless, abstract, but unmistakably a being. These are not just stones. They are statues. They are persons, rendered in the form of great standing pillars, and the whole enclosure is full of them, ringed with them, watched over by them. The central pair are the most clearly human of all. On the great central pillars of the best preserved enclosure, the arms and hands are carved with special care, and below them, around the waist of the pillar, there is a carved belt decorated with symbols, and hanging from it, a carved garment, something like a loincloth, in the shape of an animal pelt. These beings are clothed. They wear belts and buckles and garments. They have arms and hands. They stand 5 meters tall, facing each other across the centre of the sanctuary, towering over anyone who would have stood among them. And yet, and this is the haunting part, they have no faces. Where a face should be, on the broad, flat front of the head, there is nothing. No eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Blank. These are powerful, clothed, human-shaped giants, standing at the heart of the oldest temple in the world, and they gaze out at us across 11,000 years with faces that were deliberately left empty. Who are they? This is one of the deepest questions the site poses, and the honest answer is that we do not know for certain, but we can reason toward the likely truth. They are clearly not ordinary people. Ordinary people are not rendered 5 meters tall in stone at the centre of a sanctuary. They are beings of great importance, and their scale and their placement suggest they are more than human, greater, higher, set apart. They may be gods, the earliest gods we have any image of, the powers these people believed stood behind the visible world. They may be ancestors, the great and honoured dead, the founders of the people, watching over their descendants from the world beyond. They may be spirits, or mythic first beings, or something for which we have no word at all. The facelessness may be deliberate reverence, that the truly sacred cannot be given a face, must not be shown too plainly, remains always partly hidden. Or the faces may have been painted on in colours that have long since weathered away, or rendered in some perishable material now lost. We cannot say. But we can feel, standing among them, what their builders surely felt, that these are watchers, presences, powers, great silent figures gathered in a ring, clothed and armed and human-shaped, presiding over whatever took place in that sacred circle beneath the open sky. And consider what it took, spiritually and imaginatively, to conceive of them at all. To carve a being 5 meters tall out of solid limestone is not a casual act. It requires that you first imagine such a being, that in the minds of these hunter-gatherers there already existed a rich conception of powers greater than themselves, of beings that deserved to be rendered in stone at the heart of a place made holy. The pillars are not just feats of engineering. They are windows into a mind, into a spiritual world already complex and populated and profound, 11,500 years ago, among people who had not yet planted a single field. Whatever these figures were to their makers, they tell us that the religious imagination of humanity did not begin with the temples of Sumer or Egypt. It was already ancient, already deep, already capable of raising giants, at the very dawn of the settled world. The gods, or the ancestors, or whatever they were here first, standing on the hill, before the farms and the cities they would outlast. But the pillars are not carved only with the beings themselves. They are covered as well with a whole crowded world of other images, a strange and unsettling menagerie of animals, rendered with extraordinary skill and chosen, it seems, with great care. And what is most striking about that menagerie is not that it is there, but which animals were chosen and which were left out. Because the creatures on the stones of Göbekli Tepe are not, for the most part, the gentle animals these people ate. They are the animals these people feared. Run your hand in your imagination across the surface of one of these great pillars, and you will find it alive with creatures. Carved in low relief, sometimes shallow, sometimes standing out boldly from the stone, they cover the pillars in a crowded, deliberate procession. And once you notice the pattern in them, the temple begins to feel less like a place of peace and more like a place of power, danger, and awe. Here is a fox, its body stretched along the shaft, its jaws slightly open. Here, coiled and winding down the stone in numbers, are snakes. Many snakes, sometimes dozens on a single pillar, flowing downward like water, their triangular heads unmistakable. Here is a wild boar, heavy and bristling, its tusks curved and threatening. Here is a scorpion, its claws raised and its stinging tail curled over its back, carved with anatomical precision. Here are the great birds, vultures, cranes, with their long necks and heavy wings. Here are aurochs, the enormous wild cattle of the ancient world, beasts that stood taller than a man at the shoulder and could kill a hunter with a toss of the head. Here are spiders, and what may be insects, and long-legged birds, and creatures harder to identify. And here and there, among the animals, abstract symbols, H-shapes, crescents, discs, circles, a written language of images whose meaning is lost to us entirely. Now here is the thing that stops archaeologists in their tracks, the pattern that turns the menagerie into a message. These people were hunter-gatherers. Their diet, we know from the vast quantities of bones found at the site, was built above all on gazelle, along with wild cattle, boar and other game. Gazelle were their staple, their bread and butter, the animal they hunted more than any other. and yet gazelle are almost entirely absent from the carvings. The animals these people actually ate, the gentle hunted prey that filled their bellies, were not for the most part the animals they chose to immortalize in stone. Instead, the pillars are dominated by creatures of a very different kind: predators and dangers, snakes whose bite could kill, scorpions whose sting could kill, wild boar and aurochs whose charge could kill, foxes cunning and wild, vultures, the great birds that feed on the dead, spiders, beasts of tooth and claw and venom and death. This is not a celebration of the hunt or a record of the food supply. This is something else. This is a bestiary of danger, a gallery of the things that threatened and frightened and fascinated these people. The powers of the wild world, the forces of death, gathered and carved and set watching around the sacred circle. Why? What did it mean to fill a temple with images of the creatures that could kill you? We cannot know for certain, but the possibilities are rich and revealing. Perhaps these animals were guardians, dangerous powers enlisted to protect the sacred space, to ward off enemies and evil, the ancient equivalent of the fierce beasts and monsters that would later stand guard at the gates of temples and palaces across the world. Perhaps they were the spirits of the wild itself, the untamed forces that these people lived among and needed to appease or honour or hold at bay. Perhaps they were connected to the specific beliefs and myths of the people, clan symbols, totems, the animal emblems of different groups who gathered at the site, each carving its own creature into the shared stone. Perhaps they were bound up with death and the journey beyond it, with the vulture that consumes the body, and the snake that lives in the dark earth, and the scorpion that dwells in the shadows. Perhaps all of these at once. What is clear is that the world these carvings express is not a soft or comfortable one. It is a world charged with danger and power, alive with forces greater than the human, a world in which the boundary between the living and the dead, the human and the animal, the safe and the deadly, was thin and constantly present. These people did not build a temple to celebrate their comfort. They built it, it seems, to confront the great and frightening powers of existence, and they surrounded themselves in that sacred place with carved images of exactly the things that filled them with awe and terror. There is something profoundly human in this, and profoundly ancient, and it reaches across the 11,000 years to touch something we still recognize. We too fill our sacred and our storytelling places with images of danger and death and power. Our cathedrals crawl with carved gargoyles and demons. Our myths and our art are full of dragons and monsters and beasts. We are drawn, in our deepest imaginative life, not to the safe and the gentle, but to the fearsome, the powerful, the deadly, because those are the things that force us to confront the largest questions, the questions of danger and death, and what lies beyond. The people of Göbekli Tepe, at the very dawn of the sacred, were already doing what we still do. They were gathering, in a place set apart, to face together the terrifying and magnificent forces of the world, and they were carving those forces into stone so that they would stand and watch forever. The menagerie of fear on those pillars is, in a sense, the oldest surviving expression of the religious imagination, of the human confrontation with the powers of life and death, and it is already, at the very beginning, unmistakably ours. And among all these creatures of danger, one appears again and again with special prominence, one that carries a particular weight and points toward one of the deepest purposes of the whole site: the vulture, the great bird that circles above the dying and descends upon the dead. To understand why the vulture haunts these stones, we have to talk about death, about what these people did with their dead, and about a relationship with mortality so different from our own that it can be hard at first even to comprehend. But before we descend into that darkness, let us pause and rest for a moment on the hill, in the open air, under the enormous sky. For a moment before we go down into the dark, let the hill be quiet. It is late in the day on the plain, 11,000 years ago. The work has stopped. The great stones stand in their ring on the summit, their carved beings and their carved animals catching the low gold light of evening, throwing long shadows across the swept ground. Below, the land stretches away in every direction. The rolling hills, the wide plain, the distant blue smudge of the mountains, the thin threads of the rivers catching the last of the sun. There is wood smoke somewhere, and the smell of roasting meat, and the low murmur of many voices, for people have gathered here, as they gather every year from across the whole region. The gazelle move in their herds far out on the plain. A hawk turns slowly overhead, and the great faceless watchers stand in their circle as they have stood for generations, looking out over all of it in silence. There is no city here, and there will not be one for thousands of years. There is no writing, no metal, no wheel, no king. There is only this, a hill made holy by human hands, a ring of carved giants, and a people who have come together across the distances of their scattered lives to build something that will outlast every one of them. They do not know that they are the first. They do not know that what they are doing here, on this hill, is the beginning of a road that leads to everything. They know only that this place matters, that the powers gathered here are real, that it is worth the enormous labour to raise these stones and to return, and to return, and to return. The sun goes down behind the western hills. The fires are lit. The stars come out over the plain in their tens of thousands, the same stars these people have watched all their lives, wheeling slowly over the silent stones, and the great watchers keep their vigil in the dark as they will keep it for centuries, and then for millennia beneath the earth, waiting for eyes that will not open again for 11,000 years. To understand the vulture that haunts the stones of Göbekli Tepe, you have to set aside almost everything you feel about that bird, and about death, and enter a world that thought about both very differently from ours. To us, the vulture is a grim and ugly creature, a symbol of decay circling over the dying, a thing of ill omen. And death, to most of us, is something to be hidden, sanitized, kept behind closed doors, its physical reality something we rarely see and prefer not to think about. But to many ancient peoples, and the evidence suggests to the people of Göbekli Tepe and their world, the vulture was something quite different, and death was something faced directly, physically, and as a sacred passage rather than a horror to be hidden away. In this older way of understanding, the vulture was not a monster, it was a helper. It was the creature that carried the dead from this world to the next. The practice is called excarnation, or sky burial, and versions of it have been performed by peoples around the world well into modern times. Rather than burying the body whole in the ground, the dead are laid out in the open, in a special sacred place, and left exposed to the elements and to the birds, above all to the vultures, which descend and strip the flesh from the bones. To our modern sensibilities, this can sound gruesome, but to the people who practiced it, it was an act of profound spiritual meaning. The vulture, rising into the sky with the substance of the dead, was understood to carry the soul upward, to release the spirit from the body and bear it into the heavens, into the realm of the sky and the powers that dwelt there. The great bird was not desecrating the dead, it was liberating them. It was the sacred vehicle of the passage from earth to sky, from the world of the living to the world beyond. And this may be exactly why the vulture appears again and again on the stones of the first temple. The clearest and most haunting evidence sits on a single pillar, one of the most famous and most debated objects in all of prehistory. Archaeologists call it the vulture stone. On its surface, carved in bold relief, is a large vulture, its great wings spread wide, one wing curved almost like an arm, and it seems to be presenting or lifting or attending to a round object, a disc or ball above it. Nearby, carved on the same stone, is a scorpion, that creature of the shadows and of death, and below the vulture, small and stark, is the figure of a human being, but a human being who is missing his head. A headless body, beside the great vulture with its outstretched wing and its disc, beside the scorpion. The scene is charged with meaning that we can feel even if we cannot fully translate it. It speaks of death, of the vulture, of the body and its separation, of the head removed. It is, most scholars believe, a depiction of death and its rituals, of the passage of the dead carried by the vulture in the sacred place where these things were done. And that head, missing from the carved body, points to another extraordinary discovery, one that reveals just how central the dead were to the whole meaning of Göbekli Tepe. Among the remains excavated at the site, archaeologists have found human skulls, and some of these skulls bear deliberate carved marks and grooves cut into the bone after death. This appears to be evidence of what scholars call a skull cult, a set of ritual practices centered on the heads of the dead, in which skulls were separated from bodies, modified, decorated, perhaps displayed or carried or venerated. The skull, the seat of the face and the self, held special power. To keep it, to mark it, to honour it, was to keep some presence of the dead among the living. This practice was not unique to Göbekli Tepe. It appears across the Neolithic world of the Near East, where the dead were often kept close, their skulls sometimes plastered and painted to recreate the face set up in the homes of the living. But at Göbekli Tepe it takes on a particular resonance, because here the skull cult sits at the very heart of a great sanctuary, alongside the vulture and the headless figure and the scorpion, in a place that seems more and more to have been deeply concerned with death and the dead. To feel how different this relationship with the dead really was, it helps to look at the wider world these people belong to, because Göbekli Tepe did not confront death in isolation. Across the whole Neolithic Near East, in the same era and the centuries that followed, human beings were developing an intense, intimate, and to our eyes startling relationship with their dead. At settlements not far away in time and place, archaeologists have found the dead buried not in distant cemeteries, but beneath the very floors of the houses, under the platforms where the living slept and ate. The ancestors kept literally underfoot, woven into the fabric of the home, present and near and not sent away. And at several of these sites they found something even more striking. Skulls that had been removed from the buried bodies and then transformed. The bare skull would be built back up with plaster, modelled carefully into the shape of a living face, the features recreated in clay, sometimes with shells or paint set in for the eyes, so that the skull became, once more, a face. The face of a particular remembered person, kept in the house of the living, set on a shelf or buried and dug up again, held and honoured across the generations. These plastered skulls are among the most haunting objects in all of prehistory. The faces of the dead, remade by loving hands, gazing out of the deep past with shell eyes, kept close by the descendants who could not bear to let them go entirely. Set Göbekli Tepe against that background, and its concern with death and skulls no longer looks strange or isolated. It looks like the grandest expression of something these people felt everywhere, a refusal to let the dead simply vanish, a need to keep them present, to honour them, to maintain a relationship across the boundary of the grave. In the homes, the dead were kept underfoot, and their faces remade in plaster. On the hill, perhaps, the dead were honoured on a monumental scale, in a great sanctuary where the vulture carried the soul, and the skull was marked, and the great faceless watchers may themselves have been the towering forms of the ancestors, gathered in a ring, presiding over the rights of a whole people. The intimacy with death that these people lived every day in their houses was written large, at Göbekli Tepe, in stone 5 meters tall, so a picture begins to form, dim but powerful, of what Göbekli Tepe may have been for. Not only a temple to gods or ancestors in some abstract sense, but a place bound up intimately with death, with the passage of the dead, with the rituals that carried them from this world to the next, with the honouring and keeping of the dead among the living. Perhaps the dead were brought here, or laid out here, or their skulls kept and venerated here. Perhaps the great gatherings that raised these stones were, in part, gatherings around death, funerary rites, ancestor ceremonies, the collective facing of mortality that binds a people together more powerfully than almost anything else. The faceless giants at the centre may be the great dead, the honoured ancestors, watching over the rites performed in their presence. The vulture may be the carrier of souls, the snake the dweller in the earth to which the body returns, the whole menagerie a map of the forces that surround the passage from life to death. And in this too Göbekli Tepe reaches across the ages to touch something deeply familiar. For what is religion, in so much of its history, but the human response to death? The awareness that we will die, that everyone we love will die, is perhaps the deepest wellspring of the sacred. It drives us to imagine what lies beyond, to honour and to keep our dead, to gather together in the face of the unbearable fact of mortality, and to make of it something meaningful, something bearable, something holy. The people of Göbekli Tepe at the very beginning of the sacred were already doing this. They were already gathering to face death together, already imagining the passage beyond, already keeping their dead close and honouring them in stone. 11,000 years before our own funerals and tombs and prayers for the dead, on a hill in Anatolia, human beings were confronting the same darkness we confront, and building in response to it the first temple in the world. But confronting death was only part of what drew them to the hill. There was also, it seems, something far warmer and more communal at work. Great gatherings and great feasts and the deep human joy of coming together. And that joy, strangely, may be one of the keys to the greatest mystery of all, how they built it and why the building changed the world. Set aside for a while the question of what the stones meant, and ask instead a simpler and in some ways more staggering question. How, in purely practical terms, did they do it? Because when you look closely at the engineering of Göbekli Tepe, the mystery only deepens, and the achievement becomes almost impossible to believe. Start with the pillars themselves. They were cut from limestone, quarried from the bedrock of the surrounding plateau, some of them only a few hundred meters from where they were finally raised. The quarries are still there, and in one of them lies perhaps the most humbling object at the entire site. An unfinished pillar, still lying in the bedrock where it was being cut, abandoned before it could be freed. It is enormous, around 7 meters long, and estimated to weigh perhaps 50 tons. 50 tons! The finished pillars that were actually raised weigh, on average, less than that, many of them in the range of 10 to 20 tons, but even the smaller ones are colossal. Far heavier than anything these people had any obvious means to move, and they cut them, and shaped them, and carved them, and moved them, and raised them upright, and did it over and over again, dozens of times across the whole site. Now remember what they did not have. They had no metal. Not a single metal tool existed anywhere in their world. Metalworking would not be invented for thousands of years. Everything they did to that hard limestone they did with stone, with tools of flint and harder rock, hammering and grinding and cutting the stone with other stone, an almost unimaginably laborious process. They had no wheel. The wheel, too, lay thousands of years in the future. They had no pulleys, no cranes, no iron levers. They had no draft animals, no oxen, no horses, nothing domesticated to pull a load, because animals had not yet been domesticated. They could not even, as far as we know, call upon the organising power of a state, a king, a bureaucracy, a system of forced labour, because none of those things existed either. They had stone tools, rope of plant fibre, wooden levers and sledges, and their own muscle and ingenuity. And with those, and nothing more, they quarried and moved and raised 10-ton and 20-ton monoliths, and they did it with such precision that the pillars stood and stayed standing for thousands of years. How? We can reconstruct the likely methods, and each one is a testament to human ingenuity. To quarry a pillar, they would have hammered channels around its outline into the bedrock with stone tools. Patient, brutal work, days and weeks of pounding, then driven wedges beneath it to break it free. To move it, they most likely used sledges and rollers of wood, dragging the immense weight across the ground on ropes, with dozens or perhaps hundreds of people hauling together, or using wooden levers to inch it forward. To raise it upright, they may have dug a pit at the destination, slid the base of the pillar toward it, and then hauled the top upward with ropes and levers and sheer coordinated muscle until it dropped into the socket and stood. Every stage would have demanded enormous numbers of people working in careful, practiced coordination, pulling together on command, timing their efforts, managing the ropes and levers, keeping the whole precarious operation from ending in a crushed body or a shattered stone. This was not the work of a family or a small band. It was the work of a crowd, a large organised cooperating crowd, working together toward a shared goal over a long period of time. And that is where the engineering mystery becomes a human mystery and points towards something profound. Because a large, organised, cooperating crowd is exactly the thing that hunter-gatherers were not supposed to be able to assemble. Hunter-gatherer bands are typically small, a few dozen people at most, because a small band is all that a foraging way of life can usually feed and hold together in one place. To gather hundreds of people at a single site, to keep them there long enough to quarry and move and raise these stones, to coordinate their labour and settle their disputes, and above all to feed them all, this requires a level of social organisation that, by the old story, only farming societies with their surplus and their hierarchy could achieve. And yet the people of Göbekli Tepe achieved it, without farms, without cities, without kings. They found a way to bring large numbers of scattered independent hunter-gatherers together and to organise their collective labour on a monumental scale. And the question of how they did that, what held the crowd together, what motivated the labour, what fed the workers, leads to one of the most beautiful and surprising theories in all of archaeology. The answer, it seems, was not force. There is no sign of kings or overseers or coerced labour at Göbekli Tepe, no palaces, no evidence of a class of rulers driving a class of the ruled. The answer seems instead to have been something far more human, far warmer, and far more powerful than force. The thing that brought these people together, that motivated the staggering labour, that held the crowd together through the long, hard work of raising a mountain of stone, was the very thing the site was built for. It was the sacred. It was the shared belief, the shared ritual, the shared meaning that drew people from across the whole region to this one holy hill. They came not because they were forced, but because they wanted to. Because this place, and what happened here, mattered to them more than almost anything. And when they came, they did what people have always done when they gather for something that matters. They celebrated, they feasted, and in that feasting may lie the key that unlocks not just Göbekli Tepe, but the birth of civilization itself. Imagine the gatherings. Across the region, in scattered bands, the hunter-gatherers of this land lived their ordinary lives, hunting the gazelle, gathering the wild grain, moving with the seasons in small groups spread thin across a wide territory. But at certain times, in certain seasons, they came together. They left their scattered camps and travelled sometimes for days, converging from all directions on the holy hill. And there, for a time, the scattered people became a great gathered crowd, hundreds strong, perhaps more, assembled in one place for a shared purpose, and a crowd like that has to eat. The evidence for this is written in bone and stone across the whole site. Göbekli Tepe is buried in the remains of enormous quantities of animals, the bones of tens of thousands of gazelle, of wild cattle, of boar and deer and wild sheep, along with the bones of ducks and geese and other game. This is not the ordinary refuse of a settled village slowly accumulating over generations. It has the character of great feasts, of huge amounts of meat consumed in concentrated bursts, the leavings of gatherings where whole herds were hunted and roasted and eaten by large numbers of people come together for a special occasion. The building of Göbekli Tepe, it seems, was accompanied by feasting on a massive scale, great communal meals that fed the assembled workers and worshippers, that celebrated the gathering, that turned the hard labour of raising stones into a festival. And there may have been more than meat. Among the finds at the site are large limestone vessels, great troughs and vats, some capable of holding well over 100 litres. In the residue inside some of these vessels, analysis has detected chemical traces that some researchers interpret as the byproducts of fermentation, the signature, possibly, of some of the earliest alcoholic drink in the world, a kind of ancient beer, brewed perhaps from the wild grain that grew so thickly on the surrounding hills. The interpretation is debated, as so much here is, and we should hold it lightly. But the image it conjures is irresistible and, in its essentials, quite plausible. Great gatherings at the sacred hill, hundreds of people come together, feasting on roasted gazelle, and perhaps drinking a fermented brew in the shadow of the great carved stones, the labour and the ritual and the celebration all bound together, the raising of the temple and the great communal feast one single joyful, meaningful event. Now follow the logic of this, because it leads somewhere extraordinary. To feed hundreds of people at a great gathering, to provide the mountains of meat and grain that such a feast required, is itself an enormous challenge. Wild resources, however abundant, are unpredictable. The herds move, the harvest varies, a gathering of hundreds strains even a rich landscape. If you want to hold such gatherings reliably year after year, if the sacred hill and its ceremonies matter enough that you need to keep coming back and keep feeding the crowds, then you need a more reliable, more concentrated, more controllable source of food than the wild alone can offer. You need, in other words, to start managing the food supply, to gather and store the wild grain in bulk, to tend the stands where it grows best, to begin, perhaps, without quite intending to, the long, slow process of selecting and cultivating and eventually domesticating the plants that will one day become crops. The pressure to feed the sacred gathering may have been one of the forces that pushed these people step by step toward farming. And here is the astonishing thing, the fact that makes this theory more than a pretty story. The wild ancestors of our domesticated grain, the wild einkorn wheat, from which the first farmed wheat was bred, have been traced through genetic studies to a specific region, and that region is right here. The genetic homeland of domesticated einkorn wheat lies in the mountains just a short distance from Göbekli Tepe, a matter of a few dozen kilometres. The very place where the first temple was built is also essentially the very place where wheat was first domesticated. The two of the most important developments in the whole human story, the first monumental sacred architecture and the birth of agriculture, happened in the same small corner of the world at almost the same moment in history. That cannot be a coincidence. and Göbekli Tepe suggests how they were connected. The temple came first. The gatherings it required, the crowds it drew, the feasts it demanded created the pressure and the occasion to master the wild grain. And out of that mastery grew agriculture, and out of agriculture grew the settled village, and the town and the city and everything after. Not bread first and then belief, but belief first, the drive to gather and to build and to worship, and then to feed the belief, the bread. This is the great reversal, and it is worth stopping to feel the full force of it, because it changes the story of who we are. For a long time we told ourselves that we became civilized because we became farmers, that the full belly came first, and the temple was a luxury we could afford only once we were fed and settled and secure. Göbekli Tepe whispers the opposite. It suggests that the temple came first and the farm came after, that we didn't build temples because we had become civilized, but that we became civilized in part because we wanted to build temples. That the deepest engine of the whole transformation was not the stomach, but the spirit, not the need to eat, but the need to gather, to worship, to build something greater than ourselves and to return to it together. If that is true, then Göbekli Tepe is not just the oldest temple in the world. It is the birthplace of a new kind of human life, and the proof that what made us who we are was from the very beginning something more than survival. Lift your eyes now from the carved stones to the sky above them, because for the people of Göbekli Tepe, the two were surely connected. And the heavens over that hill held meanings we can only partly guess at. Imagine the night sky as they saw it, 11,000 years ago from the summit of the holy hill. There were no cities anywhere in the world to throw up light. There was no glow on any horizon. The darkness was total, and against it the stars burned in their countless thousands. The whole vast river of the Milky Way arching from edge to edge of the sky with a brightness almost no modern person has ever witnessed. To a people living under that sky every night of their lives, the heavens were not a distant abstraction. They were a living presence, a great turning wheel of lights whose movements marked the seasons, whose patterns told the stories of gods and spirits and beasts, whose rhythms governed the migration of the herds and the ripening of the grain and the whole cycle of the year. Every ancient people we know of watched the sky with intense attention, read meaning into it, and wove it into their sacred beliefs. There is every reason to think the people of Göbekli Tepe did too. Some researchers have gone much further, and here we must step carefully, because we are entering territory where fascination outruns proof. There are those who argue that the enclosures of Göbekli Tepe were deliberately oriented toward particular stars or celestial events, aligned to the heavens like the astronomical monuments of later ages. There are those who read the carvings on certain pillars, above all the famous vulture stone, not as a scene of death and ritual, but as a star map, the animals standing for constellations, the whole composition recording a specific astronomical event. In one much publicised interpretation, the vulture stone is claimed to memorialise the impact of a comet, or the fragments of one striking the Earth around the time these people lived, a catastrophe that some link to a real and mysterious event in the climate record, a sudden violent return of cold called the Younger Dryas, which interrupted the warming of the world for over 1,000 years right around this period. On this reading, Göbekli Tepe becomes a monument to a remembered catastrophe from the sky. Its stones a warning carved by survivors. It is a thrilling idea, and it deserves to be told. But it deserves just as much to be treated with honesty. And the honest truth is that most scholars who study the site are deeply sceptical of it. The excavators who spent their lives at Göbekli Tepe did not accept the comet interpretation, and there are serious problems with it. The dating it relies on, the assumption that the animals must be constellations, the reading of a complex ritual scene as an astronomical diagram. It may be true, it may be partly true, it may be entirely a modern projection, our own fascination with cosmic catastrophe read back into stones that meant something quite different to the people who carved them. This is the discipline that the deep past demands of us, to hold the wonder and the skepticism together, to let a beautiful theory be beautiful without mistaking it for proven fact. What we can say with confidence is more modest but still profound, that these people lived under a spectacular sky, that they watched it closely, that they almost certainly wove it into their beliefs, and that the relationship between the first temple and the turning heavens above it is real, even if its precise shape remains, like so much here, a mystery. And there is a deeper reason the sky matters to the story of Göbekli Tepe, beyond any specific alignment or carved constellation. The younger Dryas itself, that sudden, harsh return of cold that struck the world right around the time these people were beginning their great work, may be part of the larger story of why civilization was born here at all. For over 1,000 years, the warming world that had made this land so abundant was thrown into reverse. The climate turned colder and drier. The wild resources that had been so generous may have grown less reliable, less predictable, harder to depend upon. And some scholars believe that this stress, this squeeze on a people who had grown numerous and gathered and dependent on the wild bounty, was one of the pressures that pushed them toward new solutions, toward managing their food more actively, toward gathering together for security and meaning, toward the great communal projects that bound them into something larger. In this view, the birth of the first temple and the birth of agriculture were both, in part, responses to a changing sky and a changing world, the human answer to a moment when the old abundance faltered and something new had to be found. Whether or not the vulture stone records a comet, the heavens were pressing down on these people in a very real way, through the climate itself, and their response to that pressure was to build. Faced with a harsher world, they did not scatter. They gathered on a hill and raised stones toward the sky. For a long time, Göbekli Tepe seemed like a miracle standing by itself. A single impossible monument, unique, unaccountable, a lone flash of genius in an empty landscape. But as the archaeologists kept working, and as they began to look at the surrounding country with new eyes, they made a discovery that transformed the whole picture. Göbekli Tepe was not alone. It was not a solitary wonder. It was one site among many, the most famous member of a whole lost world of sacred hills, scattered across the region, built by the same remarkable culture. And that world is still being uncovered, right now, in our own time. Across the rolling country of southeastern Turkey, in the same region as Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists have identified a whole series of related sites, a constellation of ancient sanctuaries and settlements, dating from the same deep period, sharing the same distinctive features: the T-shaped pillars, the carved animals, the circular enclosures, the whole architectural and symbolic language of the first temple. The project that studies them has given the region a beautiful name, the Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills. It turns out that the people who built Göbekli Tepe were part of a broad and thriving culture that spread across the whole area, raising sanctuaries and forming communities at site after site over many centuries. Göbekli Tepe was not a bolt from the blue. It was the grandest surviving expression of a whole civilization of hunter-gatherers and early farmers, a network of sacred places and gathering points spread across the land, connected by shared beliefs and shared ways of building and shared images carved in stone. The most spectacular of these sister sites is a place called Karahan Tepe, not far from Göbekli Tepe, where excavations in recent years have uncovered things that are, if anything, even stranger and more startling. At Karahan Tepe, archaeologists found a chamber carved directly into the bedrock, and rising from its floor a series of tall pillars shaped, unmistakably like phalluses, a room of them, standing together, whose meaning surely touches on fertility, on life, on the generative powers these people revered. And watching over that chamber, carved emerging from the rock wall itself, is a human head and neck, a face gazing out over the room, its expression solemn and strange, one of the most arresting human depictions from the entire ancient world, seeming almost to lean out of the stone into the space of the living. The discoveries at Karahan Tepe are recent, some of them made only in the last few years, and they are still being studied, still being understood. The excavations are ongoing. This is not settled history in a dusty book. This is a story being written in real time, with new wonders coming out of the ground season after season, deepening and complicating and enriching everything we thought we knew. Think about what this means. It means that 11,500 years ago, in this one corner of the world, there was not a single miraculous temple, but a whole flourishing culture of the sacred. A people who, across a wide region and over many centuries, built sanctuary after sanctuary, carved thousands of images into stone, gathered and feasted and worshipped and buried their dead, and raised their great pillars again and again. It was, in its way, a civilization, not of cities and kings and writing, which had not yet been invented, but of shared belief and monumental building and profound spiritual life, spread across the hills of a single fertile land. And it flourished at the very hinge of the human story, in the last age of the hunter-gatherers and the first age of the farmers, at the exact moment when our species was crossing the greatest threshold in its history, from the wandering life to the settled one, from the wild world to the world we made. And the most humbling part of all is how little of it we have seen. At Göbekli Tepe itself, only a fraction of the site has been excavated, a small portion of the whole. Surveys that scan beneath the ground without digging, reading the buried structures through the soil, have revealed that many more enclosures lie hidden under the hill, still buried, still waiting. Perhaps a dozen or 20 great rings of stone that no modern eye has ever seen. And across the wider region, the stone hills hold untold more, sites known and unexcavated, sites suspected and unconfirmed, sites still completely unknown, sleeping under the soil of that ancient land. We have glimpsed only the edge of this lost world. The greater part of it remains in the dark, beneath the hills, exactly as it has been for 11,000 years. A vast buried inheritance that the future will slowly, carefully bring back into the light. Whatever we think we know about Göbekli Tepe and its world, we must hold it humbly, because the ground is still full of answers we have not yet uncovered, and questions we do not yet know to ask. But there is one question we can ask now, standing before all these stones and all these hills, a question that moves us from the grand scale of cultures and civilizations to the small and intimate scale of individual human lives. Behind every carved pillar was a hand that carved it. Behind every raised stone was a crowd that raised it. Behind the whole vast achievement were people, ordinary, mortal, particular people, who lived and worked and gathered and died on that hill 11,000 years ago. Who were they? In the small human truth of their days. What was it actually like to be there, to be one of them, to help build the first temple in the world? Let us leave the theories behind for a while and try, as far as we can, to stand among them. We have no names, not one. Of all the hundreds or thousands of people who built Göbekli Tepe across its long life, not a single name survives, because writing would not be invented for another 6,000 years. They are the most anonymous builders of the most important building in the world, and yet, through the things they left behind, the stones, the tools, the bones, the images, we can reach toward them and imagine with care the texture of their days. Picture the gathering season arriving. Across the region, In their scattered bands, the people begin to move, leaving their seasonal camps, travelling the old paths toward the holy hill, carrying what they need, converging from every direction. Some have walked for days. They arrive to find the hill already alive with people, more people than they see in all the rest of the year, kin and strangers and old friends gathered from across the whole land. There is a charge in the air of reunion, of ceremony, of shared purpose, the particular electricity of a great gathering, which our own species has felt at every pilgrimage and festival and holy day since. For most of the year these people live in small groups, seeing the same few faces. Here, for this season, they are part of something vast. That alone, the experience of belonging to a great community, of being one of many gathered for a shared and sacred purpose, must have been intoxicating, and it must have been part of what drew them back year after year across the long distances. And then the work. Some go to the quarries, where the great stone is cut, the endless rhythmic labour of hammering the limestone with harder stone, hour after hour, day after day, the sound of stone on stone ringing across the plateau, the slow emergence of a pillar from the bedrock. Some haul, dozens of them together on the ropes, hundreds perhaps for the greatest stones, dragging the immense weight across the ground on rollers and sledges, straining together, timing their pulls, a whole crowd moving as one under the direction of those who knew how. Some carve, the skilled ones, the artists, kneeling at the stone with flint tools, coaxing a fox or a snake or a vulture out of the flat surface with astonishing patience and skill, giving the great watchers their arms and hands and belts. Some hunt, ranging out across the plain to bring down the gazelle in their numbers to feed the crowd. Some tend the fires and the cooking, roasting the meat, grinding the wild grain, perhaps brewing the fermented drink in the great stone vats. Children run among it all, watching, learning, carrying, playing in the shadow of the rising stones. It is labour, and it is festival, and it is worship, all woven together into one great communal act. Feel the sensory world of it, the white glare of the sun on the pale limestone, the dust of the quarrying hanging in the air, the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, of sweat and stone and crushed grain, the sound of it all, the ring of the stone tools, the rhythmic chants that surely accompanied the hauling, the crowd's roar as a great pillar rose at last into its socket and stood upright against the sky, the music and the voices of the knights. And over everything, the great carved beings watching, the faceless giants at the centre, the animals prowling the pillars, the whole sacred menagerie presiding over the labour of the living. These people were not tourists at a monument. They were inside their religion, living it with their whole bodies, building their gods and their ancestors and their beliefs with their own hands, sweating and bleeding and singing the sacred into existence. And at the heart of it surely was awe. These were people who had, most of them, never seen a building larger than a hut. They lived in a world without monuments, without any human construction that rose above the human scale. And here, on this hill, they raised beings of stone 5 meters tall, rings of towering pillars, a place unlike anywhere else in their entire world. To walk into one of those enclosures, to stand small among the great watching giants, in the smoke and the sound and the press of the gathered crowd, with the powers of life and death carved all around you, and the open sky above, it must have been overwhelming. It must have felt like standing at the meeting point of the human and the divine in the most powerful and sacred place that existed. We build cathedrals now to produce that feeling, the smallness of the self before something vast, the lifting of the spirit toward the sublime. These people invented it. They created, for the first time in the history of the world, a built space designed to overwhelm the soul, to make a human being feel the presence of powers greater than themselves. The first temple was also the first time we ever made a place whose purpose was awe, and when the gathering ended, when the stones were raised and the feasts were eaten and the rites were performed, the people scattered again, back to their bands, back to their hunting and gathering, back across the wide land to their scattered lives. But they carried the hill with them in their memory and their belief, and they would return. Generation after generation, for centuries, they came back and built more and carved more and gathered and feasted and worshipped and buried their dead, and the hill grew and changed and deepened as a sacred place, held in the shared imagination of a whole people across hundreds of years. Until at last something shifted, some change in the world, or in the beliefs, or in the people themselves, and they did the strangest thing of all. They stopped, and before they left the hill for the final time, they took their great temple, the labour of 100 generations, and they buried it. Of all the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe, this is perhaps the strangest, the most haunting and the hardest to explain. The people who built it, in the end, buried it, deliberately, with their own hands. They took the great temple they and their ancestors had laboured over for centuries, and they filled it in, packed the enclosures with rubble and earth and debris until the towering pillars were swallowed, and the sacred circles vanished beneath a mound. And that burial is the reason the temple survived at all, and the reason it slept, hidden and forgotten, for 8,000 years. Consider first what an extraordinary act this was. It is one thing to build a temple. It is another thing entirely, after generations of building, to destroy it. Not by abandonment, not by letting it fall slowly to ruin, but by actively, deliberately entombing it. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were not left to weather away and collapse. They were carefully, intentionally backfilled, packed to the brim with tons of rubble, limestone fragments, flint tools, and the bones of the great feasts, until the whole structure was buried under a deliberate mound of debris. This took enormous labour, nearly as much, perhaps, as the building itself. The people did not simply walk away from their temple. They chose to bury it, and they worked hard to do so, and the question that hangs over the whole site is the single word: why? We do not know. But the possibilities each open a window onto the minds of these people, and each is worth sitting with. Perhaps the burial was a kind of ritual death, a deliberate decommissioning of a sacred structure that had reached the end of its life. In many cultures, a holy thing that is no longer to be used cannot simply be discarded. It must be respectfully retired, put to rest, closed with ceremony. Perhaps each enclosure, when its time was done, was reverently buried the way a body is buried, laid to rest, covered over, its power sealed into the earth. Perhaps the burial was itself an act of worship, a final offering, the return of the sacred stones to the ground from which they came. Perhaps a new enclosure could only be built once the old one had been properly entombed, so that the hill grew as a series of buried sanctuaries stacked through time, each generation's temple laid to rest beneath the next. Perhaps the beliefs changed, or the culture shifted, or the great gatherings could no longer be sustained, and the burial marked the closing of an entire chapter of the human spirit, the deliberate sealing away of a world that was ending. Perhaps it was all of these, layered across the centuries, for the burial did not happen all at once but over a long span of time as the site was used and reused, and finally at the last abandoned. Whatever the reason, the effect was profound, and doubly so. In the immediate sense, the burial was an ending, the deliberate closing of the first temple, the retirement of the great watchers into the dark of the earth, the end of the gatherings that had drawn a whole people to the hill for centuries. The fires went cold, the crowd stopped coming, the pillars, so laboriously raised toward the sky, were pulled back down into the ground, and the hill became once more just a hill. It is a strange and melancholy thing to contemplate. The first great work of human hands, sealed away by the very hands that made it, at the close of the age that made it possible. The world was changing. The hunter-gatherers were becoming farmers. The scattered bands were becoming villages. The whole way of life that had built Göbekli Tepe was passing into something new. And as it passed, the people closed the door on their first temple and buried the beginning. But in another sense, an accidental, almost miraculous sense, the burial was not an ending, but a preservation. Because a monument left standing is a monument exposed. Over 11,000 years, standing pillars would have weathered, toppled, cracked, been robbed for their stone, been ground down by wind and rain and frost and the slow erasure of time. Almost nothing left standing on the surface survives 11,000 years. But a monument buried is a monument protected. By filling in their temple, by sealing it in rubble and earth, the people of Göbekli Tepe unintentionally created a time capsule, a sealed chamber in which their great stones, their carvings, their whole sacred world were held safe and unchanged, sheltered from the weather and the ages, waiting in the dark. The very act that ended the temple's life as a living sanctuary was the act that carried it, intact, across 11,000 years to us. They meant perhaps to lay their temple to rest. What they actually did was to send it forward through time, a message in stone, sealed and preserved, addressed to a future they could not imagine, to be opened by hands not yet born, 11,000 years away. And so the great watchers went down into the dark. The faceless giants that had stood at the centre of the sacred circles, gazing at each other across the smoke and the crowds, were covered over and swallowed by the earth, still standing, still facing each other, but now in perfect blackness, in perfect silence, buried beneath the hill. And there they would remain, through the birth of farming and the rise of the first villages, through the coming of pottery and metal and the wheel, through the founding of the first cities and the first kingdoms and the first empires, through the pyramids and the ziggurats, through the whole vast pageant of recorded history, waiting, in the dark, for 8,000 years, while the world they had helped to begin went on without any memory of them at all. Let the hill fall quiet again, one last time before the long dark. The people are gone now. The final gathering has ended. The last of the rubble has been packed into the last of the enclosures, and the crowd has scattered for good, walking away down the slopes and out across the plain, back toward the villages and the fields that are the shape of the world to come. No one will raise a pillar here again. The quarries fall silent. The paths that led to the hill from every direction grow faint, and then grass over, and then are forgotten. And the mound settles over the buried temple, rounding into an ordinary hill, indistinguishable from 100 others on the wide Anatolian land. Above it the seasons turn as they have always turned. The rains come and soak the mound and drain away. The wild grasses grow green in spring and gold in summer and brown in autumn over the hidden stones. The gazelle still move across the plain, fewer now, and then the herders come with their sheep and their goats, the descendants of these very people, farmers now, and graze their flocks on the slope of the hill without the faintest idea of what sleeps beneath their feet. The stars still wheel overhead, the same stars over a hill that has forgotten it was ever holy. And down in the dark, sealed in the earth, the great watchers keep their vigil. Faceless, patient, unchanged, the giants stand in their buried circles, facing each other across the blackness as they have faced each other since the beginning, holding their silence through century after century after century, while above them the whole human world is remade. They do not decay. They do not fall. They simply wait, in the perfect stillness of the sealed earth, keeping the memory of the first temple safe in the dark for a very, very long time. What happened next in the 8,000 years while the temple slept is the whole of everything we usually mean by history. And there is something dizzying in realizing that all of it, all of recorded human civilization, came after Göbekli Tepe and knew nothing of it. Follow the thread forward from the buried hill. In the centuries right after the temple was sealed, the great transformation it had helped to set in motion swept across the region and then the world. The people who had gathered at the hill became, more and more fully, farmers. They planted the wild grain they had once only gathered and bred it over generations into true crops. They tamed the wild sheep and goats and cattle into herds. They stopped wandering and settled into permanent villages of mud brick houses, and the villages grew and multiplied and spread. The way of life that Göbekli Tepe stood at the threshold of, the settled, farming, village life, became the new normal, the foundation of everything to come. Within a few thousand years of the temple's burial, the whole Near East was a land of farming villages, and the human population was climbing, and the old wandering world of the hunter-gatherers was fading into memory and then out of memory altogether. And from those villages grew everything. In the lowlands to the south, where the great rivers watered the plain, the villages swelled into the first true cities, Uruk, Ur, and the rest. And in those cities human beings invented writing, and the wheel, and the plough, and organized religion with its temples and priesthoods, and kingship, and law, and the whole apparatus of civilization. Empires rose on that southern plain, and fell and rose again. Far to the west and south, other peoples raised their own wonders, the pyramids of Egypt, monuments that still stagger us with their scale and age. Stonehenge rose on its plain in distant Britain. Great kingdoms flourished across the world. Writing spread. The deep past receded, and the historical age began. The age of records and names and dates. The age we can read about in ancient texts. And every bit of it, every city, every pharaoh, every scribe and king and priest, every pyramid and ziggurat and temple of the entire ancient world, came after Göbekli Tepe. All of it was younger. The builders of the pyramids were closer in time to us, who look back on them, than they were to the builders of Göbekli Tepe. When the first pharaoh was crowned, the first temple had already been sleeping under its hill for 5,000 years, and through all of it, through the whole magnificent pageant of recorded history where no one knew. That is the staggering, humbling heart of the long sleep. The people who built the cities and invented writing had no idea that thousands of years before them, their own ancestors had raised the first temple in the world and then buried it. The knowledge was gone, utterly, completely erased by time. The Sumerians did not know. The Egyptians did not know. The Greeks and the Romans, who thought so hard about the deep past and the origins of things, did not know. For 8,000 years, through the entire span of everything we call history, the greatest and oldest monument of the human spirit lay a few feet beneath a hill in Anatolia, and not a single human being alive had the faintest memory that it was there. The memory had not just faded, it had vanished so completely that when the temple was finally found again, it did not confirm what anyone expected. It shattered what everyone believed. The forgetting was total. There is a particular kind of vertigo in contemplating that gulf of forgotten time. We tend to think of human history as a more or less continuous story, a chain of memory stretching back through the ages. But Göbekli Tepe reveals how fragile that chain really is, how completely a thing can be lost, how total the darkness of forgetting can be. An entire civilization of the sacred spread across a whole region that raised the first monuments in the world and shaped the birth of the settled life. And it fell so completely out of human memory that for 8,000 years no one knew it had ever existed. If Göbekli Tepe could be lost that completely, What else has been lost? How much of the human story sleeps still under the hills and the sands and the seas, forgotten so utterly that we do not even know to look for it? The long sleep of Göbekli Tepe is a reminder of the depth of our forgetting, of how much of ourselves lies buried and unremembered, of how thin and recent is the little sliver of the past we actually know. Beneath the known history is a vast dark ocean of the forgotten, and Göbekli Tepe is one island that has, against all odds, risen back into the light, and it did rise at last. After 8,000 years in the dark, after the whole of recorded history had come and gone above it, the buried temple was found again. Not by treasure hunters, not by conquerors, but by patient scholars with trowels and brushes and an unwillingness to accept the expected. The great watchers, who had waited so long in the perfect blackness of the sealed earth, were about to see the light again, and to speak, across 11,000 years of silence, to a world that had forgotten it ever knew them. Now that we have seen the shape of the mystery, let us walk more slowly among the actual stones, the particular pillars and carvings and sculptures that the earth gave back, because each one is a small marvel, and together they form a gallery of the oldest art in the world. The excavators labelled the great enclosures with letters, enclosure A, B, C, D, and others still emerging, and of these the one called enclosure D is the best preserved and the most breathtaking, the closest thing we have to seeing the first temple as it was meant to be seen. At its centre stand the two great pillars, the finest of all the watchers, rising more than 5 meters, and it is on these that the anthropomorphic vision is clearest. Their arms bend down the sides and their long-fingered hands reach around to the front. Around the waist of each runs a carved belt, decorated with strange symbols, H-shapes, crescents, and a disc. And hanging from the belt is a garment carved in the form of an animal pelt, a fox skin draped like a loincloth. These are beings, clothed and belted, and on the side of one of them a small fox leaps, as though held or worn. Around them, the ring of smaller pillars stands like a gathered assembly, and on those pillars marches the whole carved menagerie. Snakes pouring downward, a great boar, birds with long necks, a wild ass, a wounded gazelle, the crowded sacred bestiary of the enclosure. Beyond the pillars the site has given up sculptures in the round, 3-dimensional carved figures that once stood among the stones. There are boars, carved life-size, crouching and fierce. There are snarling predators, one great cat-like beast carved descending head-first down the face of a pillar, all teeth and menace, frozen mid-leap for 11,000 years. There is a strange and wonderful object the excavators called the totem pole, a tall column carved with stacked figures, one above another, beings and animals piled up the shaft in a way that recalls, uncannily, the totem poles of far distant peoples and far later ages. And from the nearby city of Şanlıurfa comes perhaps the most haunting figure of all, not from Göbekli Tepe itself, but from its world and its time. A life-size statue of a man carved from limestone, standing with his hands clasped before him, his eyes made of black obsidian set into the stone, staring out with a gaze that has not blinked in 11,000 years. It is the oldest life-size sculpture of a human being ever found, and to stand before it is to be looked at directly by the deep past, by a face made by people who lived at the very dawn of the settled world. And then there are the symbols, the marks that are not animals and not beings, but something else, something that hovers tantalizingly close to meaning without ever quite yielding it. The H-shapes, appearing again and again, sometimes upright, sometimes turned, the crescents like moons, the discs like suns or full moons or something else entirely, the zigzags and meanders. And most intriguing of all, on the top of the great vulture stone, a row of three curious shapes, rounded on top, squared below, that look, to modern eyes, startlingly like handbags or baskets or purses. These same rounded topped, square-bottomed handbag shapes appear, mysteriously, in the art of much later and utterly unconnected cultures, in the carvings of ancient Mesopotamia thousands of years afterward, and even, some point out, in the art of the ancient Americas, a world away. What did the shape mean at Göbekli Tepe? Almost certainly not a handbag. That is our modern eye imposing a familiar object. Perhaps it represented the sky, or a shrine, or a container of something sacred, or a concept we have no way to recover. The recurrence of the shape across distant cultures is most likely coincidence, the human mind reaching for simple forms rather than any hidden connection. But it stands as a perfect emblem of the whole site's power over us, a symbol that clearly meant something profound to the people who carved it, that they placed at the very top of their most important stone, and whose meaning is now utterly, permanently lost. We can see exactly what they carved. We simply cannot read it. The first temple is covered in a language of images, and we hold the book, and we cannot understand a word. There is one more thing the stones reveal when you look at them across the whole span of the site's life, and it deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. Göbekli Tepe was not built all at once, and it did not stay the same. It changed profoundly over the more than 1,000 years that people gathered and built there, and the direction of that change is itself a puzzle. The oldest structures, the ones raised first, are the grandest of all. The great circular enclosures with their towering central pillars, the monumental rings that have made the site famous, built in the earlier centuries when the people were still, as far as we can tell, purely hunter-gatherers. These are the masterpieces, the boldest and most ambitious works, and they come at the beginning. And then, as the centuries passed, the architecture changed, and it changed strangely toward the smaller and the humbler. The later structures at the site are more modest, smaller rooms, often rectangular rather than round, with smaller pillars, less monumental in every way, the grand circles giving way to more compact and less imposing spaces. The temple did not grow grander over time. It grew plainer. Why? Here again we can only reason toward the likely truth, but the pattern is suggestive because it tracks the greatest change of all. Those centuries, from the raising of the first great circles to the building of the last small rooms, are precisely the centuries in which the world was transforming, in which the hunter-gatherers who built the earliest enclosures were slowly becoming the farmers and villagers of the new settled age. And it may be that as that transformation unfolded, the great communal gatherings that had raised the monumental circles became harder to sustain, or less central, or simply changed their character. Perhaps as people settled into permanent farming villages, each with its own local life, the vast regional gatherings at the Holy Hill grew smaller and less frequent, and the architecture shrank to match. Perhaps the very success of the new way of life that Göbekli Tepe had helped to birth was what drained the great gatherings of their old power. The settled village replacing the seasonal pilgrimage, the local shrine replacing the regional sanctuary. Perhaps the shift from grand circles to small rooms is the archaeological trace of the whole world changing around the hill, the old free-gathering culture of the hunter-gatherers slowly giving way to the settled village world it had itself called into being. The temple, in this reading, records its own obsolescence, the monument to a way of life, quietly diminishing as that way of life passed into history, until at last the gatherings ended and the stones were buried and the hill went dark. Whatever the reason, the changing architecture tells us that Göbekli Tepe was not a single frozen moment, but a living place with a long history of its own, used, rebuilt and transformed across more than 1,000 years, longer than the span from the fall of Rome to today. Generations were born and died in its shadow. The world remade itself around it, and through all that change, people kept returning to the hill, kept building and rebuilding, kept honouring whatever it was that made the place holy, until the very changes the temple had helped to set in motion finally swept away the world that had built it. That, in the end, is the peculiar torment and beauty of Göbekli Tepe. Everywhere you look, there is intention. Nothing here is random, nothing is accidental. Every pillar was placed with purpose, every animal chosen with care, every symbol carved to say something to the people who gathered here. This is a place drenched in meaning, saturated with belief, a message deliberately composed by human minds, and almost all of that meaning is lost to us. We can read the emotion, the awe, the fear, the reverence, the concern with death and power and the sacred. We can read the effort, the astonishing labour and skill. But the specific content, the names of the beings, the stories behind the animals, the myths, the symbols encoded, the words that were spoken and the rites that were performed among these stones, all of that has vanished into the 11,000 years of silence. The people left us their temple. They did not leave us the key. And so we stand among the most eloquent stones in the world, and they speak to us with overwhelming force, and we cannot quite make out what they're saying, only that they are saying something, urgently, across an unimaginable gulf of time, and that it mattered to them more than almost anything in their lives. Here is something important, and something that makes Göbekli Tepe more alive and more honest than a finished story in a textbook. The interpretation of the site is still changing. What we think Göbekli Tepe was is not settled. Even the famous ideas that made it world famous, the pure temple, the temple, then the city reversal, are being questioned, refined, and argued over by the very archaeologists who study it most closely. This is not a solved mystery. It is a mystery still unfolding in real time, and that is part of what makes it so extraordinary. When Klaus Schmidt first understood what he had found, he formed a bold and beautiful interpretation, the one that made Göbekli Tepe famous around the world. This place, he argued, was purely sacred, a temple and nothing but a temple. No one lived here. There were no houses, no ordinary domestic life, no hearths of daily cooking, no signs of people dwelling on the hill. It was a sanctuary set apart, a cathedral on a hill, built by hunter-gatherers who came from across the region, only for ceremonies and gatherings, and then departed, leaving the holy place empty. And this pure separation of the sacred from the everyday was central to Schmidt's revolutionary claim that here was religion existing before and independent of settled life, a temple with no town, belief before bread. It was a powerful and elegant vision, and it captured the world's imagination. But science does not stand still, in Göbekli Tepe least of all. Since Schmidt's death in 2014, the archaeologists who continue his work have kept digging, kept analysing, and kept finding things that complicate the beautiful simple picture. They have found evidence that suggests people may, after all, have lived at or very near the site, not just visited it for ceremonies, but dwelt there. They have found systems for harvesting and storing rainwater, great cisterns cut into the rock, which would have been needed by people staying on the waterless hilltop for extended periods. They have found domestic tools and traces of the ordinary activities of daily life, mixed in among the sacred structures. And this has led many researchers to a more nuanced view, that Göbekli Tepe may not have been a pure isolated temple, with no one living there, but rather a settlement in which some buildings were extraordinary and sacred, and others were ordinary and domestic, a place where the sacred and the everyday were woven together, where people both lived and worshipped, rather than a sanctuary standing alone in the wilderness. This might sound like a small technical adjustment, but it matters because it touches the heart of the site's most famous claim. If people lived at Göbekli Tepe, if it was a settlement with special sacred buildings rather than a temple with no town, then the sharp, dramatic reversal of first the temple, then the city softens into something more tangled and in truth more realistic. The sacred and the settled may not have come one strictly before the other in a clean sequence, but may have grown up together, intertwined, each shaping the other in a long and messy and gradual process. The gatherings, the feasts, the monumental building, the beginnings of living in one place, the first steps toward managing food, all of it may have developed together, feeding one another over centuries rather than in the neat order of temple then town. The revolution was real, but it was not a single lightning bolt. It was a slow dawn. Does this diminish Göbekli Tepe? Not at all. If anything, it deepens it, and it teaches us something valuable about how we should hold the deep past. The temptation, always, with a site this astonishing, is to reach for a single clean story, a dramatic headline, a neat reversal that we can state in one memorable sentence. And those stories are seductive, and they capture the imagination, and they are not exactly wrong. But the truth of the human past is almost always richer, messier, and more uncertain than any single headline can hold. Göbekli Tepe is still giving up its secrets, still being reinterpreted, still surprising the people who know it best. The excavations continue. New enclosures wait beneath the hill. New finds at Karahan Tepe and the other stone hills reshape the picture every season. The scholars argue and revise and argue again and admit what they do not know. And that ongoing, honest, unfinished quality is not a weakness of the story. It is the story of human beings, in our own time, patiently and humbly working to understand the astonishing thing our distant ancestors left in the ground, and being willing, again and again, to be surprised by it. Whatever Göbekli Tepe finally turns out to be, we are still finding out. And there is something wonderful in knowing that the last word has not been written, that the great watchers still hold secrets, that the first temple has not yet finished speaking. Step back now from the stones and the debates, and consider the vast thing that was happening in the world around Göbekli Tepe. The single greatest transformation in the history of our species, the one this hill sits at the very heart of. For the age of Göbekli Tepe was the age when human beings stopped wandering and began to settle, when we turned from taking what the wild world offered to shaping the world to our own ends, when we crossed, forever, from one kind of life into another. And Göbekli Tepe is the great monument standing at that threshold, the marker of the moment everything changed. For more than 200,000 years, human beings had lived as our kind had always lived, as hunters and gatherers, moving with the seasons, taking food where they found it, holding nothing permanent, owning almost nothing, bound to the rhythms of the wild. It was, in the long view, the natural human condition, the way we lived for the overwhelming majority of our existence as a species, and then, in the space of a few thousand years around the time of Göbekli Tepe, in this very region, that ancient way of life began to end. People started to stay in one place. They started to plant instead of only gather, to herd instead of only hunt, to build permanent homes and store food and accumulate possessions. They domesticated the wild grain into wheat and barley, the wild animals into sheep and goats and cattle, bending other living things to human purposes for the first time. It is called the Neolithic Revolution, and it was the hinge on which the whole human future turned. Everything we are, everything we have built, every city and civilization and technology flows from that transformation, and Göbekli Tepe stands right at its centre, a monument raised in the very act of crossing over. But here is the thing we too easily forget, the shadow side of the Great Transformation. In taming the world, human beings also, in a sense, tamed themselves, and not entirely for the better. The settled farming life that began around Göbekli Tepe brought enormous power, but it came at a real cost, and the bones of the first farmers tell the story plainly. Compared with their hunter-gatherer ancestors, the early farmers were often less healthy, not more. Their diet, narrowed to a few staple crops, was less varied and less nourishing than the wide wild menu of the foragers. Their teeth rotted from the starchy grain. New diseases spread through their crowded permanent settlements and leapt to them from the animals they now lived beside. Their bodies bent under the endless repetitive labour of farming, the grinding, the digging, the harvesting, in ways the free-ranging hunters had never known. They worked harder for longer hours at more monotonous tasks than the hunter-gatherers ever had. By many measures of an individual human life, the coming of farming was not a step up but a step down. The foragers had, in their way, lived more freely, eaten more variously and laboured less. And yet, exactly as with the great settling paradox that runs through the whole beginning of civilization, there was no going back. Farming won, everywhere, permanently, despite the cost to the individual body, because it did one thing that outweighed all its drawbacks. It produced more people. Farmland feeds far more mouths per acre than wilderness does. Stored grain carries a family through the lean season that would have killed a band of foragers. Farming populations grew and grew, and a large settled population cannot simply choose to scatter back into the hills, because there is no longer enough wild food to hold them all. The door had shut behind them. Humanity had traded freedom and health for numbers and permanence, and numbers and permanence, once you have them, keep you. The people who gathered at Göbekli Tepe stood at the very edge of that trap, in the last generations of the old free life, in the first generations of the new-bound one. And their great temple may have been, in part, the thing that drew them over the edge. The sacred gathering that required the crowds, that required the feasts, that required the mastery of food, that required in the end the settling and the farming, and the whole new world of toil and abundance and no return. So Göbekli Tepe is not only the first temple, it is a monument to a turning point in what it means to be human, raised in the very moment when we began to remake the world, and to be remade by it. It marks the end of the long age of wandering, and the beginning of the age of building. It stands at the boundary between the wild human and the settled human, between the forager and the farmer, between the world that was given and the world that we make. And it suggests, in its silent, watchful way, that at the heart of that great crossing was not only the belly but the spirit, not only the need to eat, but the need to gather, to worship, to build something lasting and sacred and shared. We did not settle down merely to farm. We may have settled down in part to build temples, and the farming came in the temple's wake to feed the gathered faithful. If that is so, then the deepest engine of the human transformation, the force that turned wandering bands into the builders of civilization, was the very thing standing carved on those pillars. The reach toward the sacred, the hunger for meaning, the need to make, together, something greater than any single life. We tamed the world. In the process we bound ourselves to it, and we did it, at least in part, in the shadow of the first temple, reaching for the gods. One more time, let the hill be still before we return to our own age. 11,000 years fall away, and the stones stand again in the open air, new carved, the ring complete, the great watchers facing one another in the centre of the sacred circle beneath a sky no city has ever dimmed. The people are here, gathered from across the land, their fires burning, their voices rising and falling in the old chants, the smell of roasting gazelle carrying across the swept ground. The fox leaps on the pillar's arm, the snakes pour down the stone, the vulture spreads its wings, the firelight moves across the carved beings, and their shadows shift and lengthen on the swept ground, so that for a moment the great watchers seem almost to stir, and the whole strange, magnificent, half-understood world of the first temple is alive and present and real, in the moment before it all begins its long journey down into the dark. They could not have known what they were. They could not have known that they were first, that everything would flow from what they were doing here, that 11,000 years later people in cities they could not imagine, speaking languages that did not yet exist, would look upon their work and feel the ground shift beneath the whole story of humankind. They knew only the hill, and the stones, and the gathering, and the powers they had come to face together. They did their work, and they held their ceremonies, and they buried their dead, and in time they buried their temple, and they passed out of the world and out of all memory, leaving no names, no words, nothing but the stones. And the stones waited. Through all the long dark, through all the forgotten centuries, the great watchers kept their silence beneath the hill. And then, at last, in an age they could never have dreamed of, the earth was lifted away, and the light came down into the sealed circles for the first time in 11,000 years, and the watchers looked out again upon the world, a world that had in the meantime become everything their first temple had helped to begin. When the first pillars rose again from the earth under Klaus Schmidt's careful excavation, and the dating came back with its impossible numbers, the news moved through the world of archaeology like a shockwave, and then out into the wider world, where it has never stopped rippling. Göbekli Tepe did not just add a new site to the map of the ancient world. It forced a rewriting of the oldest chapter in the human story, and it made a small hill in southeastern Turkey one of the most important places on Earth. The rewriting was profound. For generations, the textbooks had told the story one way: farming first, then villages, then surplus, then, at the end of the long climb, cities, and only then the leisure and organisation to build temples and monuments. Göbekli Tepe turned that story on its head. Here was monumental sacred architecture thousands of years before the settled farming society that was supposed to be its precondition. Here was the temple before the town, the monument before the surplus, the sacred before the settled. Scholars had to reconsider the entire sequence of how civilization began, to take seriously the possibility that the drive to gather and worship and build had come first, and had helped to bring farming and settlement and cities into being, rather than the other way around. It was one of those rare discoveries that does not merely add to what we know, but overturns it, that sends everyone back to first principles. Whole books were rewritten. The birth of civilization, one of the best-known stories in all of history, had to be told again from the beginning. And the wider world took notice, as it rarely does with archaeology. Göbekli Tepe captured the public imagination as few ancient sites ever have, partly for its staggering age, partly for its beauty, partly for the sheer romance of the mystery. The oldest temple in the world, built by hunter-gatherers, buried by its own makers, lost for 8,000 years, rewriting everything. It appeared on magazine covers and in documentaries and in countless books and articles. It drew the fascination of scientists and mystics and dreamers alike, and inevitably its fame attracted wild speculation too, theories of lost civilizations and ancient aliens and secret knowledge, the kind of fantasy that always gathers around a genuine mystery. But beneath the noise, the real Göbekli Tepe needed no embellishment. The truth, that ordinary human beings, hunter-gatherers with stone tools, raised the first temple in the world at the dawn of the settled age, was more astonishing than any fantasy, and more meaningful because it was about us, about what our own ancestors were capable of, about the deep roots of the human spirit. In 2018, Göbekli Tepe was recognized by the world in a formal way, inscribed as a World Heritage Site, honored as a place of outstanding value to all of humanity. Today it is protected, sheltered beneath a great modern canopy that shields the ancient stones from the weather that would otherwise resume its slow work of erosion. Walkways carry visitors above and around the enclosures so that people from across the world can come and stand at a respectful distance before the great watchers can look down into the sacred circles that hunter-gatherers raised 11,000 years ago and feel, as everyone who stands there feels, the vertigo of that depth of time. For the region and for Turkey, the site has become a source of enormous pride and wonder. The oldest temple in the world, risen again from its own soil, drawing pilgrims of a new kind, people who come not to worship the old gods, but to stand in awe before the achievement of the deep human past. And around it, the work goes on. The excavations at Göbekli Tepe continue, slowly and carefully, for the archaeologists know that most of the site still lies buried, and they dig with the patience the place demands. Nearby, at Karahan Tepe and across the stone hills, new discoveries emerge season after season, each one deepening the picture, each one a new sentence in a story that is still being written out of the ground. Klaus Schmidt did not live to see all of this unfold. He died suddenly in 2014, after nearly 20 years of devoting his life to the hill, without seeing even half of it uncovered, without knowing how far the story he had begun would travel. But he had done the one essential thing. He had looked again at what everyone else had dismissed as a medieval graveyard, and he had recognized the oldest temple in the world, and he had given it back to humanity. His conviction, first came the temple, then the city, remains the great provocation at the heart of the site, argued over and refined but never dismissed, a challenge to everything we thought we knew about our own beginnings. And the stones he uncovered stand now in the light, sheltered and honoured and studied, no longer lost, no longer forgotten. The great watchers restored to the world after 11,000 years, gazing out once more over a plain that has changed beyond all recognition, keepers of a mystery that is not yet and may never be fully solved, stand back from the hill now and look at the long, long line that runs forward from it. From that ring of carved stones on the Anatolian plain to every sacred place human beings have built since. Because Göbekli Tepe is not only the first temple, it is the first link in a chain that has never been broken, and we are still, every one of us, living inside what those hunter-gatherers began. Think of what they invented there, on that hill, for the first time in the history of the world. They invented monumental architecture, the idea that human beings could build something far larger than themselves, larger than any practical need, a structure whose purpose was not shelter or defence, but meaning. Every great building raised since, every temple and cathedral and mosque and monument, descends from that first decision to make something enormous and lasting and sacred out of stone. They invented, or at least gave us our first glimpse of, organised communal religion, not the private beliefs of a single band, but a shared faith that could draw people from across a whole region to a common holy place, bind them in common ritual and command their collective labour. Every organised religion since, every congregation gathered in a shared sacred space, echoes that first great gathering on the hill. They invented pilgrimage, the journey to a holy place, undertaken across distance and difficulty, because the destination matters more than the hardship of the road. Every pilgrim who has ever travelled to a sacred site walks a path first, walk toward Göbekli Tepe. They invented the sacred gathering itself, the coming together of a scattered people at appointed times in an appointed place to face together the great questions of existence. And they invented, perhaps most importantly of all, the act of building beyond a single lifetime, of labouring on something you know you will not see completed for the sake of a community and a belief that outlast you. That last one deserves to be dwelt on, because it may be the deepest inheritance of all. The people who built Göbekli Tepe worked on it for centuries, generation after generation, each adding to what the last had begun, each raising new stones beside the old, each carving new beings into the sacred circle. No single person saw the whole of it. The ones who began it didn't live to see it grow. The ones who continued it built upon the labour of ancestors they had never known, for the benefit of descendants they would never meet. This is one of the most distinctively human things there is. The willingness to pour your life's labour into something larger and longer than your life, to work for a future you will not inhabit, to add your stone to a structure that others began and others will finish. It is the foundation of every cathedral that took 300 years to build, every dynasty, every institution, every civilization. It is the deep human capacity to belong to something that transcends the individual span, to find meaning in contributing to a whole that will outlast you. And there it is, already fully formed, at the very beginning. In the hunter-gatherers who returned to the hill across the centuries, each generation adding to the work of the last, building a temple that no one of them would ever see complete, for the sake of something they believed in more than they believed in the length of their own lives. And consider the sheer continuity of the thing. From Göbekli Tepe, the impulse to build the sacred flows forward without a break, through the temples of Sumer with their towering ziggurats, through the pyramids and vast temple complexes of Egypt, through the sanctuaries of Greece and the temples of Rome, through the great cathedrals of Europe and the mosques of the Islamic world, and the temples of Asia and the sacred structures of the Americas, an unbroken line of human beings raising stone toward heaven, gathering in built spaces to face the divine, making places of awe. 11,000 years of it, all descending from the same root impulse, first expressed on that hill. When you stand today inside any great sacred space, feeling the smallness of yourself beneath the soaring stone, the hush, the sense of a presence larger than the human, you're feeling exactly what the people of Göbekli Tepe designed their enclosures to make you feel. The technology has changed beyond recognition. The gods have changed, and changed again. But the impulse is identical, and it runs in an unbroken line back to the faceless watchers on the hill. They were the first. Everyone since has been, in a sense, building the same temple. So the true legacy of Göbekli Tepe is not a ruin. It is us, or rather a particular and essential part of what we are. It is the proof that the reach toward the sacred, the need to gather and to build and to make meaning, the willingness to labour for something greater than a single life, was there from the very beginning, at the root of the whole human project, older than farming, older than cities, older than writing itself. Whatever else we are, the tool makers, the talkers, the farmers, the builders of cities, we are also, and were from the start, the creatures who build temples. Göbekli Tepe is where we can see that truth most clearly, laid bare in stone at the dawn of everything. The hands that carved those beings have been dust for 11,000 years. But what those hands reached for, we are reaching for still. For all that we have learned, the honest truth about Göbekli Tepe is that it remains, at its heart, a mystery, and there is something worth honouring in that, something worth sitting with rather than rushing past. We live in an age that expects answers, that wants every question closed, every puzzle solved. But the first temple refuses to give us that satisfaction. It offers us wonder in exchange for certainty, and it asks us to be comfortable for once with how much we do not know. Consider the questions still standing open, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Who were the great watchers, the faceless giants at the centre of the circles, gods, ancestors, the honoured dead, mythic first beings. We do not know, and we may never know, because the people who knew left no words. Why were their faces left blank? Reverence, taboo, lost paint, or something we cannot even guess? We do not know. What did the animals mean? The snakes and scorpions and vultures and boars that crowd the pillars, guardians, spirits, clan totems, forces of death, something else entirely? We do not know. What did the symbols say? The H shapes, the crescents, the discs, the strange rounded forms atop the vulture stone. They're clearly a language of some kind, deliberate and meaningful, and we cannot read a single sign of it. Why did the people gather here, and what exactly did they do in these circles? What ceremonies, what rituals, what beliefs animated the whole vast effort? We can only guess. And the deepest question of all, why, after centuries of labour, did they bury it? Deliberately, thoroughly, entombing their own great temple beneath the earth? We do not know. We have theories, careful and reasonable, but the truth is sealed in the silence of 11,000 years, and there is the question of how much still lies hidden. We have seen only a fraction of Göbekli Tepe, a handful of enclosures out of what the ground scans suggest may be a dozen or 20, still buried, still waiting under the hill. We have only begun at Karahan Tepe and the other stone hills, where new wonders come out of the earth season after season. Somewhere under that ancient soil, right now, tonight, lie carved stones that no living eye has ever seen, beings and animals and symbols raised by hunter-gatherers 11,000 years ago and buried ever since, holding answers we do not yet have to questions we've only begun to ask, and perhaps holding questions we do not yet even know to ask. The greater part of this lost world is still in the dark. What we know is the edge of it, the first few pages. The book is still mostly closed, still mostly buried, still mostly waiting. Some people find this frustrating. They want the mystery solved, the story finished, the meaning pinned down. But there is another way to hold it, a way that may be truer to the site itself and to the spirit of all genuine inquiry into the deep past. The not knowing is not a failure. It is a form of wonder. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that the human story is far older, far stranger, and far richer than we can fully grasp. That beneath the thin, well-lit surface of recorded history lies a vast, dark depth of forgotten human experience. Most of it lost forever, some of it still recoverable, all of it a reminder of how much of ourselves we do not know. To stand before the great watchers and admit that we cannot read them, that we do not know who they were or what they meant, is not a defeat. It is an act of humility before the depth of the human past, and an invitation to keep looking, keep digging, keep wondering. The first temple keeps its secrets, and in keeping them, it keeps calling us back to the hill, to the stones, to the mystery of our own beginnings. There is a particular gift in a mystery that endures. A solved puzzle is set aside and forgotten. An open one stays alive, keeps working on us, keeps drawing new eyes and new minds across the generations. Göbekli Tepe will go on being studied for centuries, go on giving up its buried enclosures one careful season at a time, go on surprising the people who think they understand it. And each generation that comes to it will bring new questions, new tools, new eyes, and will see a little more, and will still not see it whole. The great watchers, who waited 11,000 years in the dark, are patient. They have all the time in the world, and they will go on gazing out over the plain, keeping most of their secrets, giving up a few at a time for as long as there are human beings curious enough to climb the hill and look, which is to say, in all likelihood, forever. There is a thought that returns again and again to anyone who spends time with Göbekli Tepe, and it is the same thought that haunts every ruin and every ancient stone. But here it strikes with a force found almost nowhere else, because here the depth of time is almost beyond comprehension. It is this: the hands are gone and the marks remain. Every one of the people who built Göbekli Tepe is gone, not just dead, gone utterly, beyond any trace of memory. We do not know a single one of their names, and we never will. We do not know their faces, their voices, their loves, their fears, their individual lives. They left no writing, because writing did not exist. They left no records, no genealogies, no stories that survived. They lived and worked and gathered and loved and grieved and died, and every particular thing about them, everything that made each of them a specific, irreplaceable human being, has vanished so completely that it is as if it never was. Hundreds of people, thousands, across the centuries of the temple's life, and not one of them remembered as an individual. They are the most thoroughly forgotten builders of the most important building in the world, and yet the marks remain. The stones they carved still stand. The beings they imagined still gaze out from the pillars. The animals they cut into the limestone still prowl and coil and spread their wings after 11,000 years. The fox still leaps. The vulture still lifts its wing. The great faceless watchers still face one another across the sacred circle, exactly as they were raised, exactly as their makers left them. The hands that shape them are dust so old the word barely means anything. Dust for 11,000 years, longer than all of history. But the marks those hands made have outlasted them by that same unimaginable span, and reached across all of it, and are here now, tonight, still speaking. This is the deepest and most moving truth of the whole site, and it is the truth this channel returns to again and again, because it is the truth at the heart of everything human beings build. The hand fails, and the mark outlasts the hand. There is a particular poignancy in the fact that the marks which survived are sacred ones. These people did not leave us their tools, or their houses, or the records of their trade, or the ordinary residue of their days. Those have mostly vanished. What they left us, what they made durable enough to cross 11,000 years, was their reach toward the sacred. The one thing they built to last was the temple. It is as if the deepest, most enduring part of these people, the part that survived when everything else was lost, was precisely their spiritual life, their gods or ancestors, their confrontation with death and mystery and the powers behind the world. The practical stuff of their lives has crumbled to nothing. The reach toward meaning endures in stone, and that perhaps is fitting, because the reach toward meaning may be the most enduring thing about human beings in general, the part of us that builds cathedrals and writes scriptures and asks in every age the largest questions. The people of Göbekli Tepe are gone, their meaning-making remains. Of all the things they might have sent forward into the future, it was their sense of the sacred that survived. And there is a message in that, whether they intended it or not. A message addressed across an unbridgeable gulf to us. When they buried their temple, they preserved it, and in preserving it they sent it forward through time to a future they could not imagine. They could not have known that anyone would ever dig it up. They could not have known that 11,000 years later, people in cities they could not conceive of would stand before their stones and be moved, and study them, and argue about them, and feel across the abyss of time a kinship with the nameless hands that carved them. But that is what happened. The mark reached the future. The message, whatever it was received. Not the specific meaning which is lost, but the deeper message that a mark always carries. We were here. We lived. We reached for something greater than ourselves. We made this, and we meant it, and we're gone now, but the making remains. Every carved stone at Göbekli Tepe says that, across 11,000 years to anyone who will listen. And it is in the end the same thing that every human work says to the future, from the first temple to the last word written tonight. The hand that made me is gone, but I remain, and through me, so does something of the one who made me. This is what it means to build. This is what it has always meant, since the very first temple on the very first hill. To build is to reach past your own death, to leave a mark that will outlast your hand, to send some fragment of yourself and your meaning forward into a future you will never see. The people of Göbekli Tepe did it first, and they did it magnificently, and their marks have outlasted their hands by longer than any others we know. And we do it still, every one of us, in our own smaller ways, in the things we make and the meanings we leave, and the marks we press into the world in our own brief days. The great watchers on the hill are the proof and the promise of it, that a hand can fail and dissolve and be forgotten utterly, and the mark it made can stand and speak and endure for 11,000 years and counting. In the end, Göbekli Tepe is not only a puzzle about the past, it is a question about ourselves, about what human beings are at the root, beneath all the layers of civilization we have piled up since. And it is a question worth carrying with you, quietly, long after the story is told. We have grown used, in the modern age, to a certain picture of human nature, a practical, material picture. We are, this picture says, first and foremost survival machines, driven by hunger and fear and the need to reproduce and everything else. Art, religion, meaning, the sacred, is a kind of decoration, a luxury that comes later, once the basic needs are met. Feed the body first, the spirit is an afterthought. Bread before belief. It is a picture that fits neatly with the old story of civilization, the one where farming and full stomachs came first and temples came at the end. And it is a picture that quietly tells us something about ourselves, that we are, at bottom, creatures of appetite, and that the reach toward meaning is a late and optional flourish on top of the real business of staying alive. Göbekli Tepe stands against that picture, silently, immovably, for 11,000 years. Because here, at the very dawn of the settled world, before the farms, before the full granaries, before the surplus that was supposed to make such things possible, human beings poured staggering effort into something that fed no one, sheltered no one, defended no one, something whose only purpose was meaning. They quarried and carved and hauled and raised 10-ton stones, generation after generation, not to fill their bellies, but to face their gods, or their ancestors, or their dead, or the great mysteries of existence. They did it when, by every practical measure, they had better things to do with their time and their labour. They did it because they needed to, because the reach toward the sacred, the hunger for meaning, the drive to gather and to build and to confront together the largest questions, was not a luxury they indulged after survival was secured. It was, it seems, one of the very things that drove them, as deep in them as hunger, as old as anything human. The stones suggest that we did not become meaning makers after we became farmers. We were meaning makers first, and the farming came, in part, to feed the meaning. If that is true, and Göbekli Tepe makes it very hard to dismiss, then it says something profound and even hopeful about what we are. It says that the reach towards something greater than mere survival is not a thin veneer over a purely animal core, but part of the bedrock of human nature, there from the beginning, one of the deepest and oldest things about us. It says that when our distant ancestors, well-fed and free, first had the chance to pour their surplus energy into anything they chose, one of the very first things they chose was to build a temple, to make meaning, to face the sacred to create something lasting and shared and beautiful and true. It says that we are, and have always been, the creatures who look up, who are not content merely to eat and sleep and survive, but who need, as deeply as we need food, to understand, to worship, to belong to something larger, to leave a mark that outlasts us. The first great thing we ever built was not a fortress or a granary or a palace. It was a temple. That is who we are. And so the great watchers on the hill ask us a question across 11,000 years, and it is a question each of us can only answer for ourselves. They ask what we are reaching for. They ask what we would pour our labour into if we were free to choose, what mattered to us enough to build beyond our own lives, to work at without seeing finished, to gather around and hold sacred. They ask whether we, in our age of full granaries and endless distraction, have kept faith with the thing that drove them, or lost it in the noise. They do not answer for us. They simply stand there, faceless and patient, the first monument our species ever raised, and hold up a mirror to the deepest part of what we are, the part that needs meaning as much as bread, that reaches for the sacred, that builds temples at the dawn of time and cathedrals in the middle of it, and will surely go on building some form of them until the very end. The stones do not tell us what to reach for. They only remind us with the full weight of 11,000 years that reaching is what we do, that it is perhaps the most human thing there is, and that is where we will leave them, and leave the hill, and let the long story come to its rest. The great watchers gazing out over the plain, the buried enclosures waiting in the dark, the mystery unsolved and the wonder undiminished, the first temple, standing at the beginning of everything we are, still keeping its secrets, still asking its questions, still reaching, as it has reached since the dawn of the settled world, toward whatever lies beyond. And now the long journey is over, and there is nothing left to do but rest. So let the whole story settle over you, slowly and gently, the way the soft earth settled over the buried temple all those thousands of years ago. Layer upon quiet layer, covering everything, sealing it safe in the dark. There is nothing more you need to hold on to tonight. You can let the theories go. You can let the questions go. You can let the whole long procession of stones and centuries loosen and drift away into the dark, the way it all drifted away, into memory, into silence, into sleep. Let your eyes close, if they are not closed already. Let the weight of the day go out of your shoulders, and out of your jaw, and out of your hands. Let your breathing slow and deepen and grow soft. And with each breath let a little more of the day dissolve, a little more of the noise, a little more of the holding on, until there is nothing left but the warmth of where you are, and the quiet and the slow drift down towards sleep. You have travelled a very long way tonight, back to the very beginning of the human story, and now you are home and safe, and there is nothing left to do but let go. Let your mind go out one last time softly to that hill on the plain. It is night there, as it is where you are. The great stones stand in their ring on the summit, dark against a sky thick with stars, more stars than you have ever seen, the whole vast river of them arching from edge to edge of the black sky, the same stars that turned over that hill 11,000 years ago and turn over it still. The plain stretches away in every direction, silent and cool, the wild grass is moving faintly in the night air, and the great watchers stand in their circle, faceless and patient, gazing out over all of it, keeping their long silence, as they have kept it since the beginning of the settled world. Think as you drift of the hands that carved them, the nameless people who gathered on that hill, who quarried the stone and raised the pillars and carved the beings and the animals, who feasted and worshipped and buried their dead and in the end buried their temple and passed out of the world without leaving a single name. They are gone now, all of them, gone so completely that not a trace of any one of them remains. But they were people exactly like you, with the same hopes, the same fears, the same weariness at the end of a long day, the same need to rest, the same wonder at the same stars. They lay down to sleep beneath these same stars on the same turning earth, 11,000 years ago at the end of their labours, just as you are lying down now at the end of yours. You're the newest of them. You're the latest link in a chain that stretches all the way back to the hill and the stones and the first temple in the world. And the same stars are keeping watch over you tonight that kept watch over them. There is a deep comfort in that, if you let yourself feel it. You're not alone in the dark, and you never have been. Behind you stretches an unbroken line of human beings, all the way back to the builders of the first temple, all of them reaching for meaning, all of them building something greater than themselves, all of them lying down at the end of the day beneath the same watching stars. The people of Göbekli Tepe are gone, but what they reached for endures, and you are part of it now. Part of the long human story of gathering and building and making meaning, and leaving a mark that outlasts the hand. Whatever you build in your own brief days, however small it feels, you are doing the same thing they did on the hill. You are reaching past your own life towards something that will remain, and that is enough. That has always been enough. So rest now. Let the great watchers keep their vigil on the hill without you tonight. Let the buried stones sleep in the dark, safe, waiting, as they have waited for 11,000 years. Let the plain lie silent under its enormous sky. There is nothing left to do, nowhere left to go, nothing left to hold. The story is told, the journey is over. You have come all the way to the beginning of everything and back again, and now you are home and warm and safe, and it is time at last to sleep. Let the earth settle over the day, soft and dark and warm. Let the stars wheel slowly overhead, the way they wheeled over the hill, the way they always have. Let yourself sink down gently into the quiet, into the dark, into rest. From all of us here at Ashes of Civilizations, thank you for spending this night at the beginning of the world with us. The temples rise and the temples fall, and the hands that build them turn to dust. But the reach remains, and the mark remains, and out of the ashes of every buried world, always, something new is built. That is the oldest story there is, older even than the first temple, and it is still being written, quietly, in you tonight. Rest now, traveller. Let the great watchers keep the hill. Let the first temple keep its secrets, and let the long, slow turning of the stars carry you gently down into sleep. Sleep well, and good night,